I would love to have a conversation with one of my American patriotic ancestors. His name was ELIAL MELTON. He was one of the few men standing who died there at the Alamo. I would love to have a conversation with him. I know exactly what I would say. I wouldn't talk much about my life, other than to tell him I've traveled all over the world. And as I was traveling, I could hardly wait to get back to America. America. America, the America I used to know, was one of the most wonderful countries to go home to. I would tell him, I would say, Mr. Melton, I've met people from all around the world. They held Americans in high regard. They honored us. But so much has changed now, and I want to update you and tell you exactly how it is in America. I would tell him about the big banks. I would tell him about the political mafias and the criminal enterprises run out of Washington, D.C. I would probably cry as I told him how our country has descended into a hell. I would tell him about the bought and paid for Congress and Senate. I would tell him about a president who lies to the American people, who promised them hope and gave them death and deceitful dealings in return. I would tell him about the drones. I would tell him about the warfare. I would tell him about the people starving and suffering in our country, America, right now. I would tell him about the dream I was given about Barack Hussein Obama. I would tell him about being asked in the dream, do you want to meet the president? I said yes. I would tell him how I was escorted into a room. The door opened, I walked through, the door closed. There was nothing in the room except an empty pair of men's shoes. I was led up to the shoes and left. I simply stared. I would tell him how our country has been hijacked by black and sinister forces. I would look into his eyes as I told him all of these things, and I would watch for his reactions. I would tell him how the American people have been mind-controlled through television and movies and radio and frequencies. I would tell him this. I would tell him that I felt so sad and so ashamed, but yet still so proud of my country, America. I would tell him about the traitors in Washington and in the media. I would tell him about the constant bombardment to wear people down. I would tell him how our liberties have been attacked. I would tell him about all of the executive orders signed by the president who bypasses Congress. I would tell him all of this. I would look directly into his eyes. I would thank him for the sacrifice that he made, shedding his blood and laying down his life so that Texans and Americans could be free. I would tell him about my grandparents, how they honored and respected him, and when they spoke of him, they spoke in very soft tones and told about his sacrifice. I would tell him that his sacrifice isn't in vain, that the shed blood of martyrs always cries out for justice. I would tell him that I'm so proud to have descended from him. I would tell him that we will continue to oppose the forces trying to beat us down and wear us down and destroy our very souls. I know what his reply would be. I can imagine how serious and stern his eyes would look. I can imagine him setting his jaw and shaking his head. I can imagine real tears falling from his eyes. This would be my conversation with my ancestor, ELIAL MELTON, who gave his life so long ago and died at the Alamo. The last thing I would say to him, as I took him by the arm, would be that there is hope for America.